We began looking at the article entitled 1 Second After Death. What does happen when one dies? And we began looking at the account of the rich man and Lazarus, found in Luke 16, 19 through 31, because the article pretty quickly into it brings this up. We discussed briefly whether or not this was a parable or a real event. Parable is our engraving heavenly truths. Definition, an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. And so this account does have an earthly story part to it. And yet there's a section of it that is heavenly. The part after one dies. So the first part, we could imagine that. We could say, I've seen this, or I know this situation, or yes, I believe that I can imagine a man as wealthy as the rich man. And I can picture someone possibly living in abject poverty. We have a difficulty, though, when we get into the idea of the heavenly part. We have no idea. Because why? We can't see heaven, can we? We can't see hell. We can't see what happens after one dies, other than what we see here on earth. But what does happen? If that body has a soul, which we believe, then what happens to that soul? Where do they go? What happens? We should note that Jesus, in his parables, this is not a fable, so he's not talking about giving animals or plants human characteristics. It's not a myth. It doesn't contain it doesn't contain centaurs or minotaurs or the Hydra or Hercules or various gods or Atlas holding the world on his shoulders or things like that. So obviously it does deal with some event or events that could be covered under an earthly situation. Doesn't necessarily matter. H. Lee Bowles, who wrote the Gospel Advocate commentary for Luke, when he looked at it, when he was discussing it, he treated it as a parable. I'm more inclined to say that this is a real event. Doesn't necessarily matter. I don't think it does, but we discussed it just because some people try to downplay it. It's just a parable. Well, the parable of the sower is just a parable, but it has a very important meaning, did it not? The parable of the wicked husbandman was just a parable, but yet what do we know? That we know that actually the chief leaders, the Pharisees, they understood what he was talking about. And they grew angry at Jesus. So even if it's just a parable, there's still benefit to us. And hold on one second. I heard that. So we looked at the beginning of the account. So these are two human beings, two individuals. The rich man is not named, but it described him in what type of fashion? What was said by Jesus that would have told his hearers that this was a man of wealth? Anybody remember? His clothing. He wore purple clothing, which the dyes that represent wealth. Fine linen. So his clothes designated that he had money. What was the other thing that was ascribed to him, attributed to him? Sister Linda? He fared sumptuously, ate sumptuously every day. Well, he did not go hungry. In fact, he probably overate, but he was living, he could eat sumptuous foods. Obviously a wealthy man. The other person was named Lazarus. And this is one of the other differences we find with the idea of the other. If this is a parable, then this differs from other parables in that Lazarus was, a person was given a name, and that person was Lazarus. Okay? Lazarus. And so the Hebrew name would have been Eleazar, and means God has helped. So Lazarus means God has helped. And yet, when we look at the situation, what would we say? Would we say, was a person say, your name means God has helped. How has God helped you? Because why? Why could someone say that maybe? He was a beggar. And not only that, he was a beggar that it didn't say he went to the gate of the rich man every day. He was laid at the gate of the rich man, which tells us that possibly his health was such that he could not even walk there on his own accord. He was laid at the gate. He was full of sores. And all that he wanted was what? The crumbs from the rich man's table. The crumbs would fall on the floor. He wanted that. And of course, then he would have to fight with the dogs. And what did the dogs do? They licked his sores. They licked his sores. And so, obviously, he was a very poor man. And so, we have two individuals at each extreme. Please note, the question was asked, was this the same Lazarus that we find in John chapter 11 and John chapter 12? We talked about some of the differences. And again, just the fact that here's a guy who is going to a rich man's gate, begging, full of sores, not taken care of, and yet we know the Lazarus of John 11 and 12 had two sisters, one who liked to cook, we know how. Can you expect her to allow her brother to go feed, he was going because he needed food. Well, at Martha and Mary's, there was food, was there not? So that's one of the things. We also don't find any evidence that this Lazarus was to return to the earth. That based upon what we read in the statements that Abraham made, no, he was not. And yet what do we know about the spirit of Lazarus in John chapter 11, John chapter 12? He was raised from the dead, meaning that his spirit would return to that physical body. And so those evidences there. Also the fact that this account was told prior to that, and based upon what it says, there was, gives some idea that this was in the past. So both men extreme ends of the financial spectrum. Then what happens? Actually, we'll combine them together. What happens? Both men die. We don't know exactly what the time difference was between the two, but both men died. It does appear that Lazarus did die before the rich man. How much time passed, we don't know. So, what is death? What does that mean? What is the biblical definition of death? Separation. Separation from the body. For as James wrote in James 2:26, for as the body without the spirit is dead, so then faith without works is dead also. So death is separation from the body. What is spiritual death? And those in fishers of men, let's hold off for a minute before we answer it. Get some others to give an answer to that. What is spiritual death? It's a separation.
It's a separation from Christ.
From God. We sin, thus we are separated from God. So Adam and Eve in the garden were without sin, were they not? Then they partook of the fruit, they sinned. God told Adam what would happen if they partook of that fruit. They would surely die. Well, of course, that did happen physically over 900 years later for Adam. But what happened in that day? There was a death on that day, was there not? Spiritual death, separation from God. So physical death is thus a separation of the spirit from the body. Let's note what was said when Jesus restored to life the daughter of Jairus. If you remember, this is the ruler who came to Jesus. His 12-year-old daughter was sick. Jesus gets to the house, and what are the people there saying? You're too late. Why? She was dead. And Jesus says, no, she's only sleeping. They laughed. He went in there, and what happened? We find out they were wrong. But in Luke chapter 8:55, it says when Jesus healed her, it says, and her spirit returned. And she rose up immediately. So, obviously, if the spirit had returned, then what does that mean with regard to the spirit? It had left. And it left when she had died. So we know logically then that in John chapter 11, when Jesus called Lazarus to arise from the grave, and Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days, what had happened to Lazarus' spirit in that 4 days? It had left the body. And thus, in order for Lazarus to arise from the grave, what had to happen with the spirit? It had to return. And so when we read accounts in the Bible with regard to one being raised from the dead, brought back to life, first of all, that person has died, the spirit is left. And then in order for that to happen, the spirit must return. Okay. And so again today, that's why I wanted to go by what the Bible says, because what in the physical world, what can happen sometimes? That person was blank dead. What was that, Sister Cook, first? Brain dead. Okay. Physically dead. This word I'm thinking of begins with a C. No. Clinically dead was what I was looking for. Someone was clinically dead, or technically dead, we might say. He was dead for 5 minutes, and they brought him back to life. Is that death? That's why you got to be careful there. I'm careful. And again, what happens to most people? He was dead, clinically dead, and that's the person that comes back and says, well, I was walking toward the light, and then something pulled me back. And again, as we point out, in any case we find where one was resurrected in the Bible, what do we not find?
Nobody walking toward the light.
Well, walking toward the light. Or any story, do we? We don't say, well, Lazarus came out and said, well, you know what? This is what happened when I was dead. We don't know. Could they remember what it was like? I have no clue. We know that God felt it not important to record that, did he? But we don't have any evidence that anybody says, well, this is what it was like. So, like I said, what should we say when someone, I don't know what happens when a person is like that, what happens to their brain functions or this or that, or the medicines get put in, or the treatments that get put to try to bring them back, restore their life. But it's not this. It's not this. Okay. So, the first person was Lazarus that died. What did it say about his death? It says, then Lazarus died, and what happens? Angels carried him away. And they carried him to Abraham's bosom. Okay. So what does that mean? Paradise, that's the set looking for. The idea of angels carrying them away. How is that generally interpreted, would we say? Explained. Is it physical or spiritual, generally, probably? I would say you read things, I think you generally read spiritual a lot of times. It's the idea that he was taken away. And that's what, I was reading a couple commentaries, and that's what the idea. When I was reading it, though, I really took it to mean that he was physically, actually, I could see evidence that he was actually physically carried away by the angels. Well, that sounds wonderful, doesn't it? So does that mean when one who is obedient to God dies, his body then would be carried away by the angels into Abraham's bosom? That sounds wonderful. Why? Is that the case? Well, then let me ask you this. What person's name was blank bosom? Was Abraham. Remember in Genesis chapter 25, he was buried in the cave of Machpelah, Genesis 25:9, by his two sons. Okay? We come later to the book of Genesis. In the book of Genesis, remember, Jacob died. And what was Jacob's request? He wanted to be buried back in the land of Canaan. And so remember, Joseph and his other brothers and a great number of people took Jacob back. And where was he buried? In the same cave where had been buried Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah and Leah, because Rachel was buried on the road where she died upon giving birth, near Bethel. Notice that we don't say, when they opened up the tomb, the brothers said, I only count 4 bodies here, or 3 bodies here. No, where are all the bodies? Why did I say that? Because they were still there. Meaning the angels hadn't carried them away, had they? They were still there. We go to Acts chapter 2. Brethren, as Peter speaking in Acts 2:29, brethren, I may say to you freely of the patriarch David that he both died and was buried, and his tomb is with us unto this day. Why does Peter say that? It's a contrast with regard to what Peter's situation is, with regard to what Jesus' situation is. But what does that mean? In Jesus' situation, when we went to the tomb of Joseph and Arimathea, what was not there? His body was not there. If they went to the tomb of David, and of course, knowing that the years had passed, a body wouldn't have necessarily been there, but what would have been there at least? And please note, with the way they handle things, and all likely those bones were collected in an ossuary, but his bones were there. His presence was still there, was it not? Physically, in some form. So that tells me that the angels didn't go and take David's body away, did he? So, why, if this is a physical situation, then it's obviously not something that happened. And here's the last thing. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, around verse 17. trumpet of the Lord will sound, and what will happen? The dead in Christ will, and I think it's 14, I said 5, it should be 4. What will happen? The dead in Christ will rise. Well, if their spirits are already in paradise, and we'll talk about it more, a little bit more, then what's rising? The bodies. So that tells me those bodies weren't taken away, were they? By angels. So if this was a situation, someone says, well, how then could they take him physically into a place? Well, were there instances in the Old Testament where someone did not die but was carried away? 2 examples I can think of. Elijah and Enoch. All we know about Enoch was that he walked with God. But we know that he did not die. So we don't know how that happened. But with Elijah, it's a little more explanatory, is it not? He got into a chariot of fire and was carried in the heavens. So he's there. He's been taken away. So that can't happen. So then why might the angels have done this? Listen, I do think that there's some idea that the angels do take it spiritually. And I'm not, again, trying to point this out. When someone dies, if the angels don't take them away, that doesn't mean, they're going to hell, What it is, though, could point out is what? That Lazarus' situation was so bad. We're talking about all the sores and all this, that he lacked even what? Anyone willing to bury him. He couldn't even get buried by anybody. And so who had to take care of it? God did through the angels. That's a possibility. That's a possibility. The key, though, is what? For us. Here's a man who got taken to the bosom of Abraham. Is that good or bad? I would say that's good. So then what happens to the rich man? He dies. We don't know anything about how long, we don't know the time passed. Was it years, months, days, the same day? We don't know. But it does say he was what? He was buried. And again, let's keep that in mind. We're not going to say where he ends up says, if someone gets buried, that's that's not what it's pointing out. Because we know, first of all, Abraham was buried, David was buried. Who else was buried? Jesus Christ was buried, was he not? So that's not what it's saying there. It's just saying he died. He was buried. In fact, probably being a rich man, he probably was in one of the best tombs. He was probably, his funeral and the thing was probably well attended, and it was a great event. And yet, where does he end up? It says Hades. So it says Hades. So, what does that mean? King James Version says what? Hell. Other translations, though, would say what? Hades. Let me pull out give me a second here. I've got 3 versions on my columns, and I can look it up really quickly. I believe, if my memory is right, when I looked at this last night again, it was Hades for the American Standard Version and Hades for the English Standard Version.
Chad, when you say that Jesus was buried, you're not saying like he was buried in the ground, correct?
Yes, and I would not say the rich man was probably buried in the ground in terms of what we say digging a grave. Because Joseph, I remember, whose tomb was Jesus buried in? He was buried in Joseph of Arimathea's. So this would have been a cave, some sort of opening into a rock, and that's the same what happened to Abraham. Abraham was buried, was he not? He was buried in a cave. So burial just meant they had died. Don't take it, like we do today a lot of times where we have a backhoe digging a grave in the ground. And that could be buried too, so please note that. That could be buried too. So, let's see. Gotta go a little farther, apologize. Okay, American Standard Version, and in Hades he lifted up his eyes, being in torments, and seeing Abraham afar off, and Lazarus within his bosom. Same thing for the English Standard Version. And of course, King James Version has in hell. So what issue does that cause sometimes? Or might someone think? How do we teach hell from the Bible? What is taught in the Bible with regard to hell?
Hell is the final place for Satan and his angels.
That's right. The lake of fire, the final place for, first of all, for Satan and his angels, but also for those who do what? Who are disobedient to God, have not obeyed God. Is that the situation he is here? No. The Greek word that is used in this passage is what? That's the Hebrew word. Not Gehenna. Good. That's used in other places. That is the final place. The actual word is Hades. And so just briefly, not in the article, but I thought it would be interesting. Hades is also the name of the god, the ruler of the underworld. That god's name was Hades. Any bonus points to anybody who can tell me the Roman equivalent? Let's see here. What kind of hint could I give? You might see him at Disney World or Disneyland. Astronomers find him interesting, would find this character interesting. Pluto, that's right. Yeah, so Pluto. His wife was Persephone, was his queen. The underworld was referred to as Hades, made up of two divisions, the underworld for the Greek mythology and Roman mythology. Tartarus, the deeper of the two, prison of the sons of the earth, and many times it was actually, when it was used, it was referring to the whole area. The other place was Erebus. That's where the dead would pass first as soon as they died. So, first of all, why am I supposed to take a break? Why are you saying this, Chad? That sounds interesting, and that impresses that you're trying to impress me that you pulled out that book by Edith Hamilton on mythology and looked at it for a few minutes. You're right. No, I'm not trying to do that. But some people would make the claims that Christian teachings on the underworld they came from the Greeks. In fact, they use the word Hades. Well, why do they use the word Hades? Because that meant underworld. Here's what the word we're going to use. There were rivers there in this underworld. Acheron, the river of woe. Cocytus, the river of lamentation. And if you remember anything if you've ever read anything on Greek mythology, does anybody remember how you got into the place? How did you get farther into Tartarus or to the gates?
You had to pay to ride a boat.
There was a boatman, there was a boat. When you were buried, there had to be a coin placed on your lips, and that coin was what you do to pay the boatman. Yes. And his name was Charon. And so they had to be buried, they had to be duly buried, and they had to have passage money placed on their lips. You had 3 other rivers, Pleclathon, the river of fire. You have Styx, which was the river of the 1970s rock group. No, I'm sorry, wrong Styx. River of the unbreakable oath by which the gods swear. And then you had Lethe, the river of forgetfulness. There was a gate to Tartarus. It was guarded by what creature? The three-headed dog, Cerberus or Cerberus. And he would allow you to enter in, but would not allow you to leave. And if I remember, and again, I pulled out my mythology book to refresh my memory. There was some account, I can't remember, where someone tried to bring somebody out. I can't remember who the parties were, but he got on the river, they were crossing back, and when he came on the other side, it was his girlfriend or his love of his life. She had disappeared. I had to go back and dig it. I remember that, but I don't remember the specifics. Again, I remember Hercules killing the Hydra and Hercules cleaning out the Aegean stables. Those are the things I definitely remembered. So it was guarded. There were 3 judges. I won't bore you with the names or try to pronounce their names, but they passed judgment. The good would go to a place called Elysian Field, Elysian. You might see that term sometimes used. Field, it was a place of blessings, and the wicked would go to everlasting torment. What is interesting in this, again, maybe you've had this book when you were growing up. I remember having a paperback copy, and I saw this a year or two ago in Barnes & Noble's, Edith Hamilton's Mythology. It was more of a summary. It told you the accounts, gave you a lot of great information if you just want to have a basic understanding of this. She notes in discussing Hades, this place, is that the Greeks, especially at the beginning, if you think of Homer and the underworld was really more of a place of shadows. It was mysterious, it was shadowy, but there wasn't much detail. Later poets would add in more detail, but it was really the Roman poet Virgil who, in his writings, gave more detail. He gave a lot of detail and more information with regard to this. And this is just a basic background of this idea of Hades and this. Please note that Hades, as a god, was not one who made a lot of appearances, that even the other gods didn't want to see him. And so, and of course that shows you there's that dislike of the underworld, So again, why I'm saying this, because some people say this. Think about what we read here and what I just briefly discussed. Think about what we're reading here in Luke chapter 16 and in other passages. And do you see really any similarities other than maybe both party people died and this place that they went to appeared that had 2 different places? And that later, after the final judgment, there'll be 2 different places? There's no talking about crossing rivers. There's no talking about paying the boatmen. The judges, there's 3. That doesn't tie in. Various rivers said flowing here. But let's also note this. Katie said Sheol. Sheol, Sheol, is the Hebrew equivalent of Hades. It was used some 66 times in the Old Testament. It had a generic part where it just sort of meant the depository of the dead. The depository of the dead. But it's also used as a place for a realm where the wicked receive their punishment. And some scriptures you might want to look at. would be Job 11:8, Psalm 9:17, Psalm 139:8, Proverbs 23:14. Notice these Old Testament writings. They're found in what, someone might say, well, they're found in what section of the Old Testament books? Job, Psalms, Proverbs, the book, poetry, books of poetry. Well, that's very interesting because the Greeks say you found this in their poetry. But more importantly to me is, who do we associate with the Psalms? David. Now, he didn't write all the Psalms, so let's note that. But many of the Psalms were written. Who do we associate with Proverbs? Solomon. Job, we don't know who wrote that, but it's considered to be the oldest book of the Old Testament. These were written thus, therefore, Solomon and David's reigns were somewhere around, you go in 1000 AD, 1000 BC, excuse me, 1000 AD is a little later. 1000 BC, going back, those are hundreds of years before the Greeks were writing, before the Romans were writing about this. What I'm pointing out is there was already mention with regard to the afterlife, the underworld, before the Greeks and their writings were in existence. The Jews, the Israelites, the Hebrews already had an understanding. Did they have the same understanding that we would pull from the New Testament? I don't know. I do know this, that remember when David's baby died? What did David say? You know, everyone was shocked. His baby died. They thought he'd be even worse off than he was. But what happened? He cleaned himself up, and they said, well, why are you so? He said, because I know one day I'm going to do what? I'm going to go to him. I'm going to go to him. Well, if it's ashes and ashes is dust to dust, all that's saying is you're going to be in the dust of the ground, right? But that's not what David was saying, was he? He was saying something he may not have completely understood the spirit, the soul. But he understood there was going to come a time when those who had died, there was an afterlife. And they were going to be present in that place. So the word Hades is used. Sister Gloria points at Gehenna, which is a frequent term as well, used 12 times. Not used in this passage, but when is it used? It is used with regard to the final judgment, eternal punishment. Matthew 5:22, Matthew 5:29, 30, Matthew 25:46, when the goats are cast into the fire and they'll go into eternal punishment. Place where the wicked will be cast, one of eternal everlasting punishment. Hades is used 10 times in the New Testament. This is more of a place of what? A place where the disembodied spirits of the people who die will remain until what event? The judgment day. Now, what do we see based upon this waiting room, that we might call it, allow me to use that term? Why might sometimes people say, this is the final place? Of course, they might be influenced by the King James Version, but why might they say it?
Because one is paradise, where you're in comfort.
Right.
And another one is
In torment, yep.
You're like in fire.
Yeah, it's almost like the judgment has been made, is it not? And yet we know that's not the final judgment. So what does that tell us? It points out that what? There's no change, is there? Once you die, after this the judgment. It may seem a long time, but it's really going to be a short time in this waiting room, if you that term. This Hadean realm. I got it right now, I think. Paradise or Hades. And as we say, the rich man was what? He was in torment. He was in torment. And was this torment going to be worse, better? Is the torment after the final judgment going to be worse? It was bad enough that we see that he was needing just a tip of water, cool water, would be pleasant, would be helpful to him. What do we see here, though? Do we know why the rich man was cast into Hades? Was cast into the place of torment. I'll make this comment. I don't know what type of Jew he was, but the fact that he had one who was desperately in need at his house, and it appears he did nothing to help, does show that he did not love his neighbor, did he? So that's there. How about Lazarus? Was he there because he was a beggar? Because he was poor? It appears whatever shortcomings he had financially and health-wise maybe, he still was obedient or as obedient as he could be to the law of Moses. I say it because we've got to be careful. Well then, all beggars will be in paradise. Well, that's not true. That's not true. All rich men will be in torment. Well, who is in if you allow me to use the term paradise concurrently with Abraham's bosom? Because the guy who says blank's bosom, Abraham's bosom, was what type of man financially? He was a wealthy man, very wealthy man, and yet he was pleasing to God. So obviously not all wealthy persons, and another one we could mention is Job. They were wealthy. So it's not necessarily the monies they had or they didn't have, or it's what did they do? We don't necessarily know what Lazarus did, but we do know based upon where he ended up, obviously he was doing that which is right or the best of his ability, and that he was covered by the blood of bulls and goats. Whereas on the rich man, we don't know all that he did. He may have been one of those ones who would go to the temple and pour buckets of money into the temple treasury. But we do see that if that's the case, when he had a guy on his front porch that needed some food, needed some health taken care of, he didn't do anything, did he? Didn't love his neighbor, at least. So they end up here. And so now, we'll stop here and we'll pick up looking a little bit further at these two places. Okay. Thanks for your comments, your attention, answering questions, and the like. Greatly appreciate it.